Tim, you're an emergency physician. Could you share a little bit about your educational background, please?
Well, I went to college, of course, like most of us do, and did pre-med. I went to Weimar College, but then after that, I did my master's in public health. I decided to do that in Mexico for several reasons, but I wanted to make sure my Spanish became very strong. So I did my master's there, and then I went back to do pre-med at Andrews. Then I studied at Loma Linda University for medical school. Then I went to Stanford for residency.
You mentioned once that you felt it's an obligation for you to be a doctor. Could you please elaborate on this?
Sure. It comes from an exercise that my biology teacher did when I was studying pre-med. He said if you shrunk the world down to 100 people, that you would have 51 women, 49 guys, 60 of them would be Asian, and then he went down all the statistics of what those 100 people would look like. And I can't ever forget the last thing that he shared. He said that only 1 out of 100 of those people would even have the chance to go to college. And most of us don't even think that, right? We think, well, what college will I go to? Where will I go to college? Not if I will go to college. So I feel like I haven't just been given the opportunity to go to college, but I've done my master's, I've done medicine, I've done residency. And I believe that since I've been given that opportunity, which is so rare, that I have a greater obligation to serve, and to serve more, and to serve in a greater capacity because I have the ability to do that. In other words, whatever has given you advantage over someone else, over the other 99, you should use those talents and resources to serve others to a greater capacity.
You travel also in different countries, other countries, to give talks on health and spiritual topics. How is this possible for you to still work as a physician at the same time?
Well, that's a great question, Lisa. The answer that I give is that we all have 24 hours in a day, and we all decide what we're going to do with those 24 hours. I used to take my work schedule and then fit ministry in around that schedule, but I don't do that anymore. What I've decided to do for the last 2.5 years is that I create my ministry schedule first, and then I work in between those times. Right now, I work as a locums physician, and what that means is you're a temporary physician, meaning you're there to fill in when other people want to take vacation or people are sick or things like that. But in my field, it is very high demand, so I have 4 or 5 hospitals at a time that are wanting shifts from me. So I work about 60 to 80 hours a month, but the nice thing is about a temporary physician is that you give them your schedule. So I say I can work these blocks in the next 3 months, and they either take it or they leave it. And sometimes they'll take them all, sometimes they'll take none of them. But thank God that I'm in a position where I have no debt, and I'm very careful with my money, and God has really blessed my investments. So even if I don't work 1 month, then I'll be fine. Like last month, I worked 91 hours. This month, I work none, but I have like 3, 4 mission trips that I have planned internationally for this month. So I've decided to put ministry first, and work falls into place. And I can tell you, since I've decided to do that, I'm doing better financially than I've ever done before in my life. So God always provides, and He always takes care of us.
You also travel from time to crisis countries to help out when there are disasters. What was the most challenging trip what you have?
Wow, I would probably say that the most challenging trip was the genocide in Sudan, where people from northern Sudan were slaughtering people in southern Sudan. It was very sad because most of the trauma victims were women and children about your age. And that was very hard for me to see, that people would attack women and children. The hardest thing was not necessarily the medicine, because I'm used to seeing wounds, gunshot wounds, knife wounds, things like that. But the hardest thing I found was it was difficult to bring them care. Like, for example, when I entered the country, they wouldn't let me take in all my bags. I had a big box of medicines, even a box of activated charcoal for the wounds, and they wanted money from me. They wanted to hold on to those boxes. But I didn't understand that that's what they wanted. They said, well, you can't take this in. but they were waiting for me to offer them a bribe. I had to get a letter from the Minister of Health, and he said, give this guy his supplies. And by the time they let it go, I was already leaving the country. So I had to function with only one of my boxes. And so it was difficult, even though I told them in customs, look, this is for your people. It didn't matter. In fact, they charged us, I think, $300 or $400 each for a visa to come help them. So it was very, very difficult even to deliver care. It was also very remote. We couldn't even take a plane in. We had to take a UN helicopter into this area, but it was 500,000 people in that area, and they had only one physician. And it was very, very difficult because there was too many people to see, and some people even died because we couldn't get to them in time. But we certainly did our best, but at one point, there was a challenge because the wounds weren't closing. In fact, I went around and I even prayed with everyone, and I made sure everything was sterile because initially the wounds were full of flies and pus, and it was horrible. And so we cleaned up all the wounds. We made everyone do sterile technique. We used the proper equipment and gauze and antibiotics. But even then, they were healing, but they weren't closing. Like there was a girl who had a shotgun wound through her thigh, and it was about this big, and it wasn't getting any smaller, even though there wasn't any pus or flies anymore. And one day I was just praying. I said, Lord, no one's getting any better. What is going on? And he impressed me. He said, stay after you're done. Stay here. And I said, Lord, I work 12 hours a day while I'm here. I'm tired. And he said, stay. So I stayed. And I noticed after it started to get a little cooler, the patients had their families come visit them. And their families brought them a meal. And I asked them, what's for supper? And they said, what do you mean by the word supper? I said, what's for your third meal? They said, third meal? This is our first meal. And so I realized that in these countries, if your family doesn't bring you food, the hospital doesn't give you anything. And what they were eating was just watery rice. No calories, no protein. So I immediately ran back to my house, which was just a clay hut with grass on the roof. And I gathered all of my Cliff Bars, all of my organic food bars, all my packets of nuts and everything like that. And I brought all that food back to the hospital. And I said, every patient has to eat a Cliff Bar 3 times a day. Every patient has to have a bag of nuts every day. And the nurses said, wow, can I have some? I said, no. You are not a trauma victim, but that's not the thought process there. They felt that if they were doing it, they should get some of it. And I said, no, give it to the patients. And I noticed that once that happened, the wounds started to close because people had protein and calories. And so I've never seen something that bad in another country where you're fighting against the culture, you're fighting against the government, you're fighting even against malnutrition to help people. I had a very similar experience in Bangladesh. It was 100 degrees outside, 90% humidity, and it was during Ramadan. And if you understand what Ramadan is they fast from when the sun gets up to when the sun sets. And the people are not allowed to swallow anything. So in other words, they would spit out their saliva. They wouldn't take any medicines. And everybody came in dehydrated. I used 60 liters of IV fluids in 2 days, seeing patients, because people were so dry. Like a simple urinary tract infection basically turned into a kidney infection. And this young woman who was not even 50 kilos, it took 2 liters in the vein before she even was able to pee. And that was the first time I ever saw religion damage people's health. So sometimes the hardest thing is not necessarily giving people care, but dealing with all of the factors that you're not used to.
How do you combine these 2 elements, the spiritual and the physical? How do they go hand in hand?
That's a great question, Mario. I think that when you look at the ministry of Christ, that Jesus does it best. Jesus met people's physical needs because that was their felt need. But ultimately, as they gained confidence in him as the healer of the body, they were able to believe in him as the healer of the soul. The best example I can think of is healing of the paralytic. You know, this young man was paralyzed. He was in a bed. It was so bad he couldn't get to Jesus. They broke open the roof and they lowered him down in front of Christ. And the interesting thing was, in this case, he forgave his sins first. That was the felt need. But there was doubts, there was unbelief, especially from the Pharisees. So Jesus told them, so that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, take up your bed and walk. And so God is trying to use the physical to build our faith in the spiritual, because the physical is really just a means to an end. Because of course, our physical bodies will not last forever, but it's something that we can understand. And so that's why I try to use a lot of physical illustrations. That's why I use a lot of medical illustrations. That's why much of my ministry is to the felt needs of the people. Because people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Tim, how can a young person experience true conversion? Everybody says like, look at Jesus, look at Jesus. But how do they practically, what can they do if they are not converted, but they want somehow to come to Jesus?
Yes, I think that's a very important question, Mario. I have heard that a lot, that yes, I want to be a Christian. I realize that I'm lost, but I don't want to go to church. I don't want to read the Bible. I don't even feel like changing. And ultimately, none of us will change unless we feel our need to change. And there's many motives. You can motivate someone through benefit, offer them money or a bribe or something. You can appeal to someone through threat. You can say, hey, listen, if you don't quit smoking, you're going to die, or you're going to have a heart attack. Ultimately, the greatest motive is love. But I find the illustration that works best is as if I invited you to a 7-course gourmet meal, appetizers, soup, salad, entrees, desserts, all kinds of stuff. And it's very good, very healthy. I was going to make it from scratch, local, organic, vegan, you name it. And let's say I scheduled it to be at 5 o'clock. That's when we're going to have dinner. But while you are on the way, you get really, really hungry. So you decide to eat a candy bar, right? And then you come and sit down and I put the food in front of you. How are you going to feel? Probably not hungry, right? Because you just ate the candy bar. Does the candy bar satisfy your appetite? Not completely, right? It takes care of the temporary need, but it doesn't fully satisfy. It doesn't give you good nutrition, right? That is what most of us as young people are doing. We're going around eating the candy bars. We're watching this movie, we're listening to this music, we go from this date to the next date, right? And does it satisfy? It does, a little bit, right? But it takes away our appetite for what is healthy. And so some people say, yes, you're right. I'm full of these movies, music, bad relationships, a lot of bad sort of lifestyle issues. So how do I change? Well, it's very simple. How do you make that person hungry again for the meal? They fast, right? They stop eating the junk. They stop eating the candy bar, and then after a while, their appetite for what is good will return. So I tell people that it may take a media fast for them. Maybe go out on a camping trip and just take their Bible. Unplug, deprogram. Because it's not until we gain a hunger for spiritual things that we'll even want to come to Jesus. And the problem is if we keep snacking on the just junk of the world, we won't ever gain an appetite for Christ. So that's what I tell people. If their issue is, let's say, bad relationships, then they've told me many times, Tim, I just want to marry a good, sweet Adventist girl, but I'm just not drawn to a lot of them, right? They keep getting drawn to these very worldly, made-up sort of women, and it's just they know the relationship's not good for them. And so I tell them, in order to gain a hunger for what is wholesome, you have to stop eating the junk. So I tell them, listen, go 1 year without dating anyone. And they're like, what? And I'm like, yes. Then God can start to reset your desires, to reset your values, and help to regain a natural taste back. So whatever the issue the person has, they may need to quote unquote fast. They may have to go on a complete media fast, even good media. Or if it's music, they may have to stop all music. And then they get a hunger And then finally, when they start listening to sacred music, hymns, classical, they're like, wow, this is really good. It really is quality stuff. But it's because they've taken a year off of all music, and God has been able to reset their thermostat, so to speak, to bring it back to a healthy appetite. I've really appreciated your questions, and I'm praying for each one of you that you can enjoy the abundant life that God designed for each one of us.